We're talking today about the early church. So we're going to start by looking at a few passages from the Old Testament and the New Testament. That is the Hebrew Bible and the Christian New Testament. We're going to compare them and kind of contrast them and see what the authors of the New Testament, in particular, in this case, Luke, the author of the Acts of the Apostles, is trying to say. And it turns out that, as with so much in the New Testament, you can't understand what the author is trying to say without understanding a huge portion or some significant event in the Hebrew Bible. All of what was written in the New Testament, even the things that were written more towards a Gentile or a non-Jewish audience, are making strong references to things that happened or themes within the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. And if you don't know the Old Testament, you don't see that immediately. And the more you look and see, the more you kind of understand the Old Testament, the more of these references you see. And sometimes these references are passing, right? It's not explicit. The author is not telling you, hey, I'm making a reference to this thing that happened in the Hebrew Bible. It's often been described by Tim Mackey of the Bible Project as a hyperlink. So the author of the New Testament book or the passage in question can be taken to be giving metaphorically a hyperlink, sort of by use of little words or phrases or themes back to an earlier story. They're not drawing out over the course of even multiple sentences parallels and saying, this is just like back in that Old Testament book or something like that. But they'll use turns of phrase, words that are unique or relatively unique to an Old Testament book or theme. And they'll be invoking that theme. And when you add it all up, you see all of these parallels and you see that they are expanding on a theme from the Old Testament and they're trying to say something. It differs by context. We're going to look at one such case today. So let me share my screen and we're going to look at one of these cases. That's not what I'm looking at. So we're first going to look at Genesis. So we talked about this when we talked about Judaism. This is the story of the Tower of Babel. Now, I'm not going to read through it. I'm going to note a few things. The point, as we talked about with the Tower of Babel, is often misconstrued. The problem was not that they were trying to get to God or something like that they were trying to build a tower up to God. The problem, this is honestly a hyperlink here back to Genesis 1, 2, and 3. The problem is that they are not fulfilling the thing that God initially commanded people to do, which was to expand, fill the earth with the kind of order that he had started in the Garden of Eden. So he told them, go out, fill the earth, expand, multiply, subdue the earth, that is, bring order to it, the kind of order that God brought to the earth when he created the earth and everything in it. When he created Eden, right, as this local order that was meant to be expanded by humans. Okay, so the problem in the Tower of Babel is that they say, no, we're going to try to stay in one place and not be scattered. You can find that in verse 4. Let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its tops in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the earth. So that's a hyperlink there, right? The very command in the first few chapters of Genesis was that they be dispersed. And they're saying, we don't want to be dispersed. Let's build a tower. We talked about how this might be a ziggurat, a place for God to come down. Ziggurats were common in other ancient civilizations. But look what God does in response to this sin, this violation of the commandment. He says, come, let us go down, confuse their language. I want to really hone in on that word confuse, so that they may not understand one another's speech. So he dispersed them over the face of the whole earth, and they left off building the city. Now, some people have argued, we're going to look at a second passage now, but okay, before we go to that second passage, let's hone in on what was important here. The result of the Tower of Babel and the sin committed at Babel was a separation of people by language. You might infer from that a separation by culture and nation too, but right here it just says language. we'll get to maybe the nationhood part in just a second. But they're being separated by language. That's God's, I don't know, want to call it a punishment per se. It could be a punishment. It could just be trying to keep the same sin from happening again. So before that, humanity was unified somehow. And notice after this, it's in chapter 12 of Genesis that God chooses Abraham and says, I'm going to make a great nation out of you, and that nation will be my people. And that becomes Israel. So it's only after God divides people by language that he picks one particular people and language and nation and ethnicity to make a particular covenant with. You keep these laws and I'll protect you and you will be my chosen people and you'll make me known to all the earth. But the point, as we talked about, was ultimately by picking one particular nation to be a remnant of humanity, to bring back all humanity into the proper relationship with God and each other. So the point was to get back to the Garden of Eden state where everybody, all the people, were meant to be in relationship with God and in proper relationship with each other. Okay, so we need to remember all of this, right? Before we even get to the New Testament, we have to keep all of this in our heads because this is all going to be super important for understanding what's happened in the second book of Acts. So let's look at one other passage real quick. This is in Deuteronomy chapter 32. I bring this passage up because some people, I'm thinking of Michael Heiser, he's a scholar of the Bible, Christian scholar. And he argues that this is a reference, especially in verses 7 through 9 here, is a reference to the very same event, the Tower of Babel. Remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations. Ask your father and he'll show you, your elders and they will tell you. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the people according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is his allotted heritage. Now, there's a lot there. Heiser actually argues pretty persuasively, whether we should accept it or not, that the number of the sons of God here, what's being said here is that when God divided people up at the Tower of Babel, he put some sort of other supernatural being over the other nations, and he took Israel as his sort of pet nation. But every other nation had some sort of other supernatural being, whether you want to call it an angel or a demigod or whatever, over it, sort of governing it. And then Heiser makes the argument that these gods or demigods or angels or supernatural beings eventually rebel, and that's part of the explanation in the Old Testament of all of the evil in the world. But we don't need to focus on that right now. What's really coming to us right now in this passage is that he's dividing the nations. If we can take Heiser's word that this isn't a reference to the Tower of Babel incident, and I think his evidence there is just that, there's a division happening. People are being divided by nationhood, which is closely associated with language. And then just as in chapter 12 of Genesis, God picks Abraham to make, or to, ultimately be the seed of Israel and be his chosen nation that he makes a covenant with. In verse 9 here, Deuteronomy is saying the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is his allotted heritage. He's ultimately referring to Israel here. So Heiser thinks this is a reference to the Tower of Babel incident, which is just to say, if we can assume that that's right, he is dividing nations apart after the Tower of Babel. So not only languages, but also nations and cultures. He's dividing them up, whereas they weren't divided before, and he's taking Israel as his chosen nation. But note, this was never the ultimate goal. And his ultimate goal is to get back to the prior state where people are not divided in this way, right? Where people are united in the proper worship of God and proper relationship with God and with each other as they were meant to be in the Garden of Eden. It's ultimately, he's endorsing Israel as his chosen nature to try to get back to a place where all of humanity is in that kind of relationship with him. Okay, so that's the big picture in the Hebrew Bible. Now, let's go to Acts 2 and see if we notice anything familiar. Now, this is right after Jesus has ascended. Luke is the author of the Acts of the Apostles, and Luke and Acts were originally one book, right? They were together. So Jesus ascends, and then he says, hey, wait for the Holy Spirit to come. The Holy Spirit, we don't know what that is yet. or as far as this class goes. We don't know what that is yet. So when the day of Pentecost arrived, they were all together in one place. Be watching kind of for similar themes or even words here to what we've just talked about. And suddenly there came from heaven a sound like a mighty rushing wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. And divided tongues as of fire appeared to them and rested on each of them. These are the apostles. The 12 now, because Judas has been replaced. Judas was the apostle that betrayed Jesus, committed suicide. They replaced him with Matthias. And they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. You might be noticing similar themes here, right? The tongues came and rested on them and gave them the ability to speak in other languages, right? What were we just talking about with the Tower of Babel? God divided them according to languages. He confused their tongues, right? He made them speak in other languages so that they couldn't communicate. So not only are we talking about languages, similar, just pure language, right? We're talking about languages here, and there being different languages. But think about this. The point of the Tower of Babel was God responded to the Tower of Babel by making them unable to communicate to each other. But what is the Holy Spirit, that is, as we'll see, spoiler alert, God doing in this event at Pentecost? He is enabling them to communicate to each other across cultures and languages again. That's what's happening. Now, we're not going to read through the rest of this. A lot of people, let's talk about the big picture real quick. What that means and what Luke is clearly doing and hyperlinking to is he's saying, hey, remember how, as part of the consequences of our sin, God divided us and kept us from talking to each other? That's being undone here. God is coming in somehow as a result of Jesus' death and resurrection. We don't know how yet. God comes in and is reuniting people. He is enabling communication across these languages. It's by the power of God. These are apostles who do not speak these other languages. Now, why is this important? Well, Pentecost was a Jewish holiday when lots of Jews from outside Israel came in, right? They came in and they spoke other languages. So they're coming in from all these nations. And it turns out, if you really want to get into the nitty gritty, we're not going to here. In verses 5 through, looks like 11, all of these nations are named, and it turns out they're pretty much roughly exactly those that are named in the Old Testament. So it's the very same nations that God divided apart after Babel for their sin. They're coming back all together here, and they're hearing, and they're able to, and at least the apostles are able to communicate to them across this language barrier. So in the Tower of Babel, confusion. We don't want you to communicate. After Pentecost, now God is enabling communication across this divide. So he confused them, and now he's confused the tongues, the languages. Now he's bringing that, he's dissipating that confusion. That's what Luke is doing here. It's super clever, and it's really it's not so on the nose that you kind of have to know what's going on in the Old Testament to see it here, right? Even the various, Michael Heiser makes the case that just the very language Luke is using is the same language, divided tongues, right? So Luke was relying on the Septuagint, was a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, and he's writing in Greek, right? So he's reading Greek from the Old Testament, he's writing in Greek, and he's using the very same Greek words that are used in the Tower of Babel and Deuteronomy stories. Divided tongues. You actually don't, in this translation, this is the ESV, you don't see the word confusion here, but in Deuteronomy you saw the word confusion, and here they're translating it as bewildered or amazed and astonished, perplexed, but it's ultimately the same Greek word. So Luke is actually using, it's kind of masked here. You can't see it because of the English translation, but Luke is using the very same language. He's like, so all of these people are confused, but they're not confused because they can't understand language like they were at Babel. They're confused because they can understand what's being said, right? So let's expand out even further. What is Luke's point here? Well, the point is something like this. Because of what Jesus has done, he has reconciled people to God and to each other in a way that God is actually accomplishing through Jesus his ultimate purpose of reestablishing his relationship with humanity as a whole, as opposed to Israel in particular. Remember, that having that relationship with Israel in particular is kind of it's a result of a failed plan. The original plan was to have a perfect relationship with all humans. And then people sucked and failed and sinned. And so he had to make this special covenant relationship with Israel. But like we just said, remember, I told you to hold on to this. The goal was always to reestablish a relationship with humanity in general. So what Luke is telling us is he's telling us for thousands of years, we've had these Hebrew scriptures that have been leading us to this conclusion. How does God make his relationship with humanity good again, as opposed to just Israel in particular, right? He has this particular relationship with Israel, but not with all of humanity. We knew he wanted to bring back relationship with all of humanity. How is he going to do it? And Luke is telling us, we've been wondering this, and now we know. It's through the work of Jesus on the cross and in his resurrection that he is enabling us, all of humanity, to be in right relationship with him again, right? And so the apostles are actually able to communicate the message of Jesus, this unifying figure and factor, even though they don't even know the languages. So they're speaking in languages by the power God gives them that they don't know, right? And it's by the power of the Holy Spirit, which Christians think is one of the persons of God. There's one God, but there's three persons. That's the doctrine of the Trinity. We could talk about that for a long time, but that's not the topic of this video. God is enabling them to speak across this divide, and Luke is telling us he's bringing us all back into the fold through the work of Jesus. That's the ultimate point here. So now let's talk real quick. We focused in sort of with laser precision, or kind of more microscopic, on these passages, to kind of give you just an example to show you how the New Testament kind of ties in with the Old Testament, how you have to kind of understand the Old Testament, understand what's going on in the New Testament. And now let's talk more, but this was really kind of the jump starter for our talk of the early church, right? This was one of the first events in the life of the early church, the coming of the Holy Spirit. And what the Holy Spirit did was it enabled people, it empowered people to do the work that God had given them. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the early church more generally. So there was this is going to tie in directly with the Tower of Babel reference. There was a disagreement early, and if you read the book of Acts, you'll see a lot of it is about this big disagreement among the early church. And this kind of doesn't make sense to us, thinking of Christianity as this distinct religion from Judaism. But it really wasn't in the early church. The earliest Christians were all Jews, for the most part, at least very generally. It was a Jewish movement. The early Christians still went to synagogue. They still practiced Jewish law, as we talked about in our Judaism segment. They still did all the things that Jews did. Jesus did. I mean, he reinterpreted, or not reinterpreted, but summarized the law in ways that were surprising to many of the Jewish leaders at the time. But he said, I came not to abolish, but to fulfill the law. He did not come to do away with the Jewish law. And similarly, the apostles and the early church thought the same way about it. They were Jews. They didn't think of themselves as a separate religion necessarily. Yes, they were Christians, but that didn't mean anything about whether they were Jews or not. And so there was this big disagreement early on, like, look, Jesus was Jewish, we're Jewish. Why think that this is a message or a religion for people outside of Judaism? Now, Paul thought that it was. And eventually Peter was convinced. Peter was, again, another one of the apostles. And eventually this dispute was resolved. So everyone, even Jews pre-Jesus, thought that Gentiles, that is non-Jews, could come into the Jewish religion. So it wasn't a question of whether Gentiles could be Christians. It was a question of whether they could be Christians without being Jews or without practicing Jewish law. That was the question. And eventually, there was a party that said, no, they need to do exactly what we do as Jews. And then there was another party, kind of represented by Paul, that said, no, they don't have to. Look, they don't have to practice Jewish law. They don't have to be Jews to be Christians in the fullest sense. And eventually Paul won that argument. And it was eventually decided that the gospel of Jesus was for everyone, all of humanity. This goes right back to what happened at Pentecost, right? Luke is very clearly showing us that God meant Jesus to reconcile all of humanity to himself. And if you look at the Hebrew Bible, this is clear, right? This is not something that Christians imposed on the Hebrew Bible. This was always the plan. So if Christians think that Jesus was the fulfillment of the Jewish plan in the Hebrew Bible, which they do, then they have to think that he was bringing all of humanity back into the fold of a relationship with God. And if you see, Christians see Jewish law as part of a really particular covenant with God that was not original to humanity. So if God is bringing all of humanity back and he's kind of doing away with this mindset of having this special relationship with Israel where they do special things, then he's doing away with the need to do all of those special things in order to be in right relationship with God too. That's the Christian view. So it was originally, if you go to Acts chapter 15, the compromise sort of that was eventually decided was they don't have to follow Jewish law, but there's some things in Jewish law that are still binding. So the idea behind it's said that they need to abstain, quote unquote, they need to, quote, abstain from the things polluted by idols and from sexual immorality and from what has been strangled and from blood. Those are the parts of Jewish law that they need to follow. Now, what's interesting about that is that some of those things, there's this clear divide in Jewish law, which we talked about, where some of the things are very just sort of markers of Judaism that seem sort of arbitrary from the standpoint of morality, like, you know, not eating something with the cloven hoof or whatever, you know. And then other things seem central to morality. They're part of Jewish law, like the Ten Commandments, right? These are sort of central to morality. They're treated as universal for all people. What's interesting about this list is that some of the things that's required of Christians that even Paul agrees to do seem to be those universal moral requirements. And that's what you'd expect. Like if you're doing away with these particular covenant things that Israel agreed to in covenant with God, just the things that mark them as a distinct people, you'd expect all of those more arbitrary laws to go away. And for the universal laws of morality, things like not worshiping idols, avoiding sexual immorality, to stay. And that's true. But you also get in there some of these, what seem to be more particular to Jewish identity laws about avoiding things that have been strangled. What's morally required about that? Or from blood. What's particularly morally heinous about that? So that's an interesting feature of this sort of early church. I want to call it a compromise. It's not really a compromise because really the non-Jewish party won. They said, you know, you don't have to follow all of Jewish law. Okay, here's just a little bit more about the early church. If we're just judging, Acts is really our main resource here. Yeah, so we talked about how a lot of them went to synagogue and temple and kept Jewish law more so earlier, and then as Christianity spread throughout the ancient world, and as this dispute was resolved in Paul's favor, it was less so and less so. They would meet in people's houses for weekly services. They apparently shared their possessions. A lot of the early few chapters of the Acts of the Apostles is about their sharing of possessions. In fact, there's a really scary story early on in Acts about a married couple who come and tell the early church that they've sold all of their property, as was the custom that was, you know, quickly established. Sell your property, give the proceeds to the church, and we'll all live communally. Well, they kind of did that, but they told the church that they had sold it for a lower amount than they had actually sold it for, and they pocketed the rest, and then they gave that smaller amount to the church. At any rate, they were struck dead, not by the early Christians, but apparently by God. So anyway, but that was common. They were living in a much more communal way than Christians, at least now, at least in America, do. They were caring for the widows and the orphaned. The widows in that day had no way of supporting themselves. Heavily persecuted for about almost 300 years. Even by the Roman Empire itself and by others. Paul, like I said, was one of the Jews who persecuted the early church. But in 313 AD, so almost 300 years after the death of Christ, after almost 300 years of persecution, the Roman Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Toleration, and Constantine converted to Christianity and made it the state religion of Rome. Okay, so how did the early church work organizationally? Well, this is a little bit of a topic of dispute, particularly among Catholics and non-Catholics. Basically, it's Catholics versus everybody else, including the Eastern Orthodox and the most Protestant of Protestants. It's clear, here's what's clear. Churches were under a bishop, and a bishop would preside over a large area like a central city and then the surrounding area, right? So Rome had a bishop, Alexandria was another huge city, Jerusalem, and Antioch. Those were the four major bishops. There were other bishops, but they were the four. So you're the bishop of Rome, you're over all of the churches in Rome. You're the bishop of Alexandria, you're over all of the churches in Alexandria. They were really important figures in early Christian life and thought. The disagreement is whether the Bishop of Rome had authority over the other bishops. That's the disagreement between the Catholics and the non-Catholics. The Bishop of Rome, according to Catholics, did have special authority over all the other bishops. And since those bishops had authority over their churches, to be the Bishop of Rome is to have authority over all the Christian churches in the world. And that's the Pope. The Pope is the Bishop of Rome. And so Catholics will point to different texts that they claim support the view that the Bishop of Rome from very early on, we're talking like early hundreds AD, was exercising authority over other bishops. But it's not totally clear. There's not decisive evidence for that. There's some evidence for it, but there's not decisive evidence. And there's lots of people who can explain away those instances in the texts. And they'll say, well, no, what's clear is that maybe that had emerged after a few hundred years, but that wasn't essential to the early church. And in fact, what would happen is whenever there was a disagreement, the bishops would all get together and just kind of argue it out and come up, they would talk for days or weeks or months. The bishops would get together, they would talk it out, any major disagreement in the early church, and they would come up collectively, not with any one bishop exercising authority, would come up collectively with the official Orthodox teaching of the church. That's how they would resolve disputes. So that's sort of the way the life of the early church worked. Now, like we said, there's some disagreement about it, and there's lots of scholarly dispute that we wouldn't still have Catholics and Protestants if there weren't. But that is where we'll stop for now.